The blood-curdling scream echoed through the canyon walls as Sarah Valdez watched in horror as the first surge of water rushed toward her, turning the dry creek bed into a raging river within seconds. She had been sketching the magnificent rock formations when the sky above had been perfectly clear, no warning of the flash flood that now threatened to swallow her whole. Sarah scrambled backward, her skirt heavy against her legs, her boots slipping on loose pebbles. The roar of water grew deafening, drowning out her panicked breathing as she frantically searched for an escape route. The sheer canyon walls rose 40 feet on either side, offering no easy path to safety. Her art supplies, the charcoals and parchment she'd saved for months to purchase, scattered in the wind, but survival trumped sentiment now. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving landscape of the Texas Hill Country showed no mercy for a 23-year-old woman who'd ventured too far from Austin alone. The water surged closer, already ankle-deep and rising fast. "Up here. Move." The deep voice boomed from above, and Sarah's gaze shot upward to see a man on horseback at the canyon rim. He had already dismounted and was sliding down the steep embankment with practiced ease, a rope secured around his waist. The water rushed higher, now splashing against her knees with such force that she stumbled. The stranger reached her just as a powerful surge threatened to sweep her away. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of the Texas sky. "Canyon floors filling with water fast," the cowboy said, gripping her arms to steady her. "Climb my shoulders, take that root." He pointed to a gnarled tree root protruding from the canyon wall about 8 feet up. It was their only hope. Without waiting for her response, he crouched down. "Name's Preston James, and unless you fancy a swim to the Gulf of Mexico, I suggest you hurry, madam." Sarah hesitated only a moment before gathering her sodden skirt and climbing onto his shoulders. His hand steadied her ankles as he slowly stood, muscles straining beneath her weight. "Reach for it," he instructed, his voice calm despite the water now swirling around his thighs. Sarah stretched upward, fingers brushing against the rough wood. On her first attempt, she missed. On the second, her fingers closed around the root just as a violent surge knocked Preston off balance. He shouted something she couldn't hear as she clung desperately to the root, her feet now dangling free of his shoulders. Using every ounce of strength, Sarah pulled herself up, her arms burning with the effort. The root creaked ominously but held firm as she managed to wedge her foot into a small crevice in the rock wall below her. Preston was fighting against the current, which had risen to his chest. He had uncoiled the rope at his waist and now tossed one end up to her. "Secure it around yourself," he called above the roar. "I'll find another way up." Sarah fumbled with the rope, wrapping it around her waist with trembling hands. Once she tied it, Preston began working his way along the canyon wall, using the rope to keep from being swept away. He moved laterally until he reached a less steep section about 20 yards downstream, then began the arduous climb upward. The minutes stretched like hours as Sarah clung to her precarious position, watching Preston's slow progress. The water continued to rise beneath her, carrying debris, branches, bushes, even a small wooden crate on its churning surface. Finally, Preston reached the canyon rim and pulled himself over. He immediately began hauling on the rope, providing Sarah with enough stability to climb the remaining distance. With his strength supplementing hers, she managed to scale the wall, her hands bloody and raw by the time she collapsed on solid ground beside him. They lay there panting, watching as the flood waters filled the canyon to a depth of nearly 30 feet, transforming it into a raging river where minutes before they had stood on dry land. "Thank you," Sarah finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life, Mr. James." Preston, he corrected, sitting up to examine a gash on his forearm. And what kind of fool goes into Rattlesnake Canyon alone, Miss Valdez? Sarah Valdez. She pushed herself to a sitting position, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. I'm an artist. I was sketching the formations. Preston snorted. Well, Miss Valdez, your art nearly cost you your life today. There was a cloudburst up in the hills. These canyons flood faster than a saloon on payday. Despite his gruff words, there was no real anger in his voice, just the remnant of fear. Sarah noticed how his hand still trembled slightly as he unwound the remainder of the rope from around his waist. Your horse, she suddenly remembered. Where is it? Preston gestured toward a cluster of scrub oak nearby where a magnificent chestnut stallion stood tethered. Rangers waiting. He's accustomed to my foolishness by now. He stood, extending a hand to help her up. Come on, I'll take you back to Austin, unless you're camped somewhere closer. Austin, she confirmed, accepting his hand. I have a room at Mrs. Harrington's boarding house on 4th Street. Preston nodded, leading her to his horse. I know the place. Good cooking, if memory serves. Sarah allowed herself to be helped onto the horse's back, too exhausted to worry about propriety. Preston swung up behind her, and she couldn't help but notice the solid warmth of his chest against her back as he reached around her for the reins. Hold tight, he murmured near her ear, and they set off at a careful pace across the rocky terrain. As they rode, Sarah learned that Preston was a rancher with land about 15 miles outside of Austin. He'd been tracking some strays when he'd heard her scream. Providence, he said simply, when she remarked on the coincidence. Wasn't meant to be your time yet, Miss Valdez. By the time they reached the outskirts of Austin, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Sarah's clothes had dried somewhat but were stained with mud and torn in places. She dreaded the reaction her appearance would provoke at Mrs. Harrington's, where proper deportment was expected of all female boarders. As they approached the boarding house, Preston seemed to read her thoughts. I'll explain to Mrs. Harrington. She's known me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. True to his word, Preston handled the formidable widow with a charm that Sarah found surprising from a man who'd seemed so gruff in the canyon. He spun a tale of a runaway horse, hers, in this version, and his fortunate intervention that made her sound more like a damsel in distress than a fool who'd nearly drowned. Mrs. Harrington clucked sympathetically and ordered hot water for a bath to be brought to Sarah's room immediately. Before taking his leave, Preston paused at the boarding house door. You should rest tomorrow, Miss Valdez. He hesitated, then added, if you're still set on those canyon sketches, I could accompany you this weekend. Show you some safer spots with equally fine views. Sarah found herself nodding before she'd fully considered his offer. That would be most appreciated, Mr. James. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Preston, he reminded her. Saturday at 9, then. Saturday, she agreed, and watched through the parlor window as he mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering darkness. That night, despite her exhaustion, Sarah found sleep elusive. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt the rush of water, heard its deafening roar. But alongside these terrifying memories came others. The solid strength of Preston's shoulders beneath her feet, the calm authority in his voice, the way his eyes had crinkled slightly at the corners when he'd smiled at her. Sarah had come to Austin 6 months ago to escape the confines of her family home in San Antonio, where her father's expectations that she would marry the son of his business partner had become suffocating. In Austin, she'd found work illustrating scientific texts for a professor at the newly established university, allowing her to support herself while pursuing her true passion for landscape art. She had avoided male attention, focusing instead on building her reputation as an artist. Yet here she was, looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that had nothing to do with sketching rock formations. Morning brought clarity and with it, caution. Sarah reminded herself that Preston James was merely being courteous, repaying the inconvenience she had caused him. Saturday would be about art, nothing more. The week passed slowly. Sarah completed her illustrations for Professor Whitaker's latest botanical study and sold 2 landscape paintings to a wealthy cattle baron furnishing a new home in Austin. Each night, she found herself replaying those terrifying moments in the canyon, and each night Preston's face grew clearer in her memory. Saturday dawned clear and mild. Sarah dressed carefully in her most practical skirt and a sturdy blouse, packing her art supplies in a leather satchel. At precisely 9, she heard the clip-clop of hooves outside the boarding house. Preston sat astride his chestnut stallion, leading a gentle-looking mare on a lead rope. He had shaved and wore a clean blue shirt that matched his eyes. His hat, a wide-brimmed, well-worn Stetson, shadowed his face, but Sarah could see the smile that brightened his features when he spotted her. "Good morning, Miss Valdez," he called, dismounting with fluid grace. "I brought Daisy for you. She's got the sweetest disposition of any horse I own." "Good morning, Preston," Sarah replied, testing his name on her tongue. It felt right somehow. "Thank you for arranging this." He helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment, they stood close enough that Sarah could smell the clean scent of soap, and something uniquely him like sunshine on leather. Their day stretched pleasantly, as Preston led her to several vantage points that offered spectacular views without the dangers of the canyon floor. He knew the land intimately, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history, both from settler and indigenous perspectives. "My mother was half Cherokee," he explained as they sat sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples he'd brought. "She taught me to respect the land, to read its moods." "Is that how you knew about the flood?" Sarah asked, sketching quickly as the light played across a dramatic rock formation. Preston nodded. "Partly. There are signs if you know to look. Birds go quiet. The air changes." He watched her draw for a moment. "You're talented." Sarah felt a blush warm her cheeks at the simple compliment. "Thank you. It's what keeps me sane, I think, being able to capture beauty to preserve it." "What brought you to Austin?" he asked, leaning back against a sun-warmed boulder. "Most young ladies don't travel alone to set up as artists." Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was running away, I suppose. My father had arranged a marriage to a man I could never love, a man who saw me as property to be acquired." Preston's expression darkened. "I've known men like that. They view everything as something to be owned, controlled." "Yes, exactly." Sarah set down her charcoal and met his gaze directly. "I wanted more than that, needed more." "And have you found it, here in Austin?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "I've found freedom," she answered carefully. "The rest, I'm still discovering." Their conversation flowed easily after that, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen. Preston spoke of his ranch with pride and affection, describing the house he'd built largely with his own hands and the small herd of cattle he was working to expand. "It's not much compared to some spreads," he admitted, "but it's mine, free and clear." As the afternoon waned, Sarah had filled several pages with sketches and found herself reluctant for the day to end. Preston seemed to share her sentiment, suggesting they take a slightly longer route back to Austin to catch the sunset from a particular hill he knew. The spot he chose offered a panoramic view of the countryside, with Austin visible as a small collection of buildings in the distance. They dismounted, and Preston spread a blanket for them to sit on while they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. "I come here sometimes just to think," he said softly. "Puts things in perspective." The sunset was spectacular, the sky ablaze with colors that Sarah knew she could never fully capture on paper, though she would certainly try. As darkness settled around them, a comfortable silence enveloped them. "We should head back," Preston finally said, though he made no move to rise. "Mrs. Harrington will have my hide if I bring you home after dark," Sarah laughed. "She does guard her boarder's reputations fiercely." Preston turned to face her then, his expression serious in the fading light. "I'd like to call on you properly, Sarah, if you'd permit it." The formality of his request, coupled with the first use of her given name, sent a flutter through Sarah's chest. "I would like that very much, Preston." His smile in response was like the sunrise after a long night. He helped her to her feet, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary, and they rode back to Austin with new possibilities hanging in the air between them. True to his word, Preston called at the boarding house the following Wednesday evening, hat in hand and wearing a freshly pressed shirt. Mrs. Harrington, ever the sentinel of propriety, allowed them use of the parlor with the door conspicuously ajar. Their courtship progressed with a measured pace that both frustrated and delighted Sarah. Preston visited twice weekly, sometimes taking her for drives in a borrowed buggy, other times simply sitting with her in the boarding house parlor. They discovered shared interests in literature and music. Preston admitted to playing the fiddle passably well, and debated politics with a respectful passion that Sarah found invigorating after years of being expected to keep her opinions to herself. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Preston invited Sarah to visit his ranch. Mrs. Harrington nearly had apoplexy until Preston clarified that his housekeeper, an elderly woman named Alma who had helped raise him after his mother's death, would be present as chaperone. The ranch exceeded Sarah's expectations. The house was modest but solidly built, with wide windows that flooded the rooms with light. Preston had built much of the furniture himself, and there was a quiet elegance to the simple designs. "This is beautiful," Sarah told him sincerely, running her hand along the smooth surface of a dining table. "You have a gift." Preston looked pleased but embarrassed by her praise. "Just practical knowledge. My father taught me woodworking when I was a boy." The land surrounding the house was even more impressive, rolling pastures dotted with live oak and mesquite, a clear creek running along the eastern boundary. Preston showed her his small herd of cattle with obvious pride and introduced her to the 3 ranch hands who helped him run the operation. "It's not as grand as some," he said as they stood on the porch watching the sunset, "but there's room to grow." Sarah heard the question beneath his words and felt her heart quicken. "It feels like a home," she said softly. "That's worth more than grandeur." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with gentle pressure. They stood that way until Alma called them in for supper, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with words. Over the next 2 months, Sarah found herself falling deeper into love with this quiet, strong man who listened when she spoke and respected her dreams. Preston never pressured her, never presumed, but his feelings were evident in the way his eyes followed her, in the gentle touches that grew more frequent as their courtship progressed. On a crisp October evening, Preston invited Sarah to dinner at Austin's finest restaurant, a rare extravagance that signaled the importance of the occasion. He was uncharacteristically nervous, fumbling with his napkin and starting sentences only to abandon them halfway through. After dessert, he asked if she would walk with him to the small park nearby. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead as they strolled side by side. "Sarah," Preston finally said, stopping beneath a massive oak tree. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures." He took her hands in his expression earnest in the moonlight. "But I know my own heart, and it belongs entirely to you." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as he continued. "I love your courage, your passion, your talent. I love the way you see beauty in everything around you." He swallowed hard. "I want to build a life with you, one where you can pursue your art while standing beside me as my wife. Will you marry me, Sarah Valdez?" The answer was simple, inevitable. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston James." His kiss was tender, reverent, a promise sealed beneath the Texas stars. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Austin Methodist Church. Sarah wore a gown of ivory silk that she had saved for months to purchase, while Preston cut a handsome figure in a new black suit. Mrs. Harrington wept openly, having appointed herself surrogate mother to the bride, and Alma beamed with approval from the front pew. Their wedding night was a revelation of tenderness and passion that left Sarah wondering how she had ever considered marrying any other man. Preston's gentle strength, his careful attention to her comfort and pleasure, confirmed everything she had come to believe about his character. As they lay together in the quiet aftermath, Sarah's head pillowed on his chest, Preston stroked her hair with a touch so tender it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "I never thought I'd find you," he murmured. "Someone who fits so perfectly in my arms, in my life." Sarah pressed a kiss to his skin, over his heart. "Perhaps we were always meant to find each other, even if it took a flash flood to bring us together." The early months of their marriage unfolded in a harmony that seemed almost dreamlike to Sarah. She converted the small room off the main parlor into a studio, where sunlight streamed through east-facing windows each morning. Preston built her shelves for her supplies and an easel that could be adjusted to various heights. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers that inspired some of Sarah's finest work. A gallery owner from San Antonio, visiting Austin on business, saw her paintings displayed in a local shop and commissioned 6 landscapes for a wealthy client. "I told you your talent would be recognized," Preston said proudly when she shared the news. "This is just the beginning." While Sarah's art flourished, Preston's ranch prospered as well. A favorable cattle market allowed him to expand his herd and hire an additional hand. They discussed improvements to the house, perhaps adding another bedroom, enlarging the kitchen. "Planning for the future," Preston said with a smile that held meaning beyond simple construction. The future arrived sooner than they had planned. By late summer, Sarah confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was with child. Preston's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Joy mingled with protective concern, his hand resting reverently on her still flat stomach, as if already connecting with the new life within. "A baby," he whispered, awe evident in his voice. "Our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Sarah continued painting, though she found her energy waning as the baby grew. Preston insisted she rest frequently, and took to reading to her in the evenings poetry, novels, newspapers while she reclined on the sofa, his voice a soothing backdrop to her needlework. As winter settled over the Texas hill country, Sarah's thoughts turned increasingly to the birth. Her own mother had died bringing her into the world, a fact that haunted her more with each passing day. She tried to hide her fears from Preston, not wanting to worry him, but he knew her too well. "What troubles you?" he asked one night as they prepared for bed. "And don't tell me it's nothing." "I can see it in your eyes." Sarah sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "My mother, she didn't survive my birth. What if no?" Preston knelt before her, taking her hands in his. That won't happen to you. Times have changed, Doctor. Miller is experienced and Alma has helped deliver dozens of babies. You're strong, Sarah, so much stronger than you realize. His certainty comforted her, but the fear lingered, a shadow at the edges of her happiness. January brought unusually heavy rains that swelled the creek beyond its banks and turned the roads to mud. Preston grew increasingly anxious as Sarah's time grew near, stationing one of the ranch hands at the house at all times in case a messenger needed to be sent for the doctor. The baby arrived on a cold, clear night in early February, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Alma's steady presence guiding Sarah through each pain until finally, their son slipped into the world with a robust cry. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, cradling the swaddled infant with hands that dwarfed the tiny bundle. Tears streamed unashamedly down his face as he gazed at his son, then at Sarah. "You're both perfect." They named him Thomas William James Thomas, for Sarah's father, with whom she had reconciled upon news of her marriage, and William for Preston's father, who had passed away years before. Parenthood brought new dimensions to their love. Sarah watched Preston singing softly to their fussing son in the pre-dawn hours, his large hand patting the tiny back with infinite tenderness, and felt her heart expand with fresh waves of love for this man, who had saved her in more ways than one. Spring arrived, bringing with it renewed energy and purpose. Sarah began painting again, often with Thomas sleeping nearby in a cradle Preston had crafted. Her work took on new depth, infused with the powerful emotions of motherhood. On a warm April afternoon, as Thomas napped and Sarah worked on a landscape commissioned by the mayor of Austin, Preston entered her studio with an unusually serious expression. "I've had a letter," he said, holding up an envelope, "from a man named Lawrence Drake. He's a land agent for the railroad." Sarah set down her brush, giving him her full attention. "What does he want?" Preston sat on the edge of her work table. "They're planning a new spur line from San Antonio to Austin. Drake wants to purchase a corner of our land for the right-of-way, about 40 acres on the southeast boundary." "And how do you feel about that?" Sarah asked, knowing that Preston's connection to his land ran deep. He considered for a moment. "The price is fair, more than fair. And it's land we don't use much anyway." He looked at her directly. "With that money, we could build a proper studio for you, maybe even open a gallery in town eventually." Sarah stood and crossed to him, touched by his constant thought for her dreams. "This land is your heritage. If you don't want to sell part of it, we'll find another way." Preston pulled her into his arms. "The ranch is our heritage now, yours, mine, and Thomas's, and maybe more children someday." His hand cupped her cheek. "The land matters to me, but not as much as providing for our family's future. For your dreams as well as mine." They agreed to meet with Drake the following week. The negotiations were straightforward, and by May, the sale was complete. True to his word, Preston began construction on a separate studio, building a bright, airy space with large north-facing windows and built-in storage for canvases and supplies. The railroad brought changes to their corner of the hill country. Austin grew more accessible, and with it came new opportunities. Sarah's paintings gained wider recognition, eventually attracting attention from galleries as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. Thomas grew from infant to toddler, a sturdy boy with his father's quiet determination and his mother's creative spirit. By the time he was 3, he had a sister, Catherine Alma James, born on a perfect spring morning with considerably less drama than her brother. Life settled into a rhythm of seasonal work, family milestones, and quiet evenings. The ranch prospered enough to provide comfort without excess, while Sarah's art brought both satisfaction and supplemental income. They added rooms to the house as their family grew, Preston's woodworking skills evident in every detail. There were challenges, of course. A drought in '84 nearly devastated the herd until unexpected September rains saved them. Thomas broke his arm at 7, falling from a tree he'd been forbidden to climb. Catherine developed a fierce, independent streak that tested her parents' patience daily. Through it all, Sarah and Preston's partnership deepened. The passion of their early days matured into something equally powerful, but more enduring, a love tempered by shared struggles and mutual respect. On a summer evening in 1890, 14 years after that fateful day in Rattlesnake Canyon, Sarah found Preston on the porch, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in colors she had spent a lifetime trying to capture on canvas. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him on the swing he had built when she was pregnant with Thomas. Preston smiled, drawing her close against his side. "I was remembering the day we met, how close I came to losing you before I ever really found you." Sarah shuddered slightly at the memory of the rushing water. "Providence," she echoed his word from long ago. "It wasn't my time. Thank God for that." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been just a few minutes later." "But you weren't," Sarah reminded him. "You were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when I needed you most." She reached up to touch his face, still handsome despite the lines that years of Texas sun had etched around his eyes. "Just as you've been every day since." Preston turned his head to press a kiss against her palm. "I love you, Sarah James, more today than yesterday, though not as much as tomorrow." Inside the house, they could hear Catherine playing the piano, a recent addition that Preston had saved for years to purchase, while Thomas's deeper voice occasionally joined in song. Their home was filled with music, art, and love, a stark contrast to the emptiness Sarah had fled all those years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Preston asked suddenly. "Choosing this life with me instead of pursuing your art in a bigger city? You could have been famous, exhibited in New York or even Europe." Sarah considered his question carefully. "Fame was never what I wanted. I wanted to create beauty and have it recognized for what it was." She gestured toward the house where their children's laughter now echoed. "And I wanted a life filled with love. I have both. How could I possibly regret that?" Preston's kiss was as tender as their first, filled with gratitude and promise. When they parted, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky and the first stars appear. Sarah thought about the twists of fate that had brought her here: a flash flood, a cowboy's strength, a root that held firm. So many moments that could have gone differently. So many decisions that had led to this perfect contentment. "Canyon floor filled with water fast," she murmured, reciting the words that had changed her life. "The cowboy said, 'Climb my shoulders, take that route.'" Preston looked at her curiously. "What's that?" "Just remembering," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "The words that saved my life. That gave me this life." Preston smiled, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Those waters were rising mighty quick. And you were very brave," she added. "Though I never did properly thank you for ruining my second-best skirt." His laugh rumbled through his chest. "As I recall, you were more concerned about your drawing supplies than your clothing." "Priorities," Sarah said with a smile, "though I've developed new ones since then." As if on cue, the door banged open and Catherine bounded onto the porch, her dark braids flying. "Papa, Mama. Thomas says there's going to be a meteor shower tonight. Can we stay up to watch it? Please?" Thomas appeared in the doorway behind his sister, at 15 already nearly as tall as his father. "It's the Perseids," he explained. "Should be visible after midnight." Preston exchanged a glance with Sarah, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in that brief look. "I suppose we could make an exception," he said, "if your mother agrees." "I think it sounds wonderful," Sarah said. "We can make pallets on the porch. I'll get some blankets." As the children cheered and ran to help with preparations, Preston caught Sarah's hand, holding her back for a moment. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For climbing onto my shoulders that day, for taking that route, for building this life with me." His eyes held hers, still capable of making her heart race after all these years. "For everything." Sarah leaned in to kiss him once more, brief but filled with promise. "Always," she whispered against his lips. "Always." Hours later, as meteors streaked across the velvet sky and their children's excited whispers gradually gave way to the deep breathing of sleep, Sarah lay with her head on Preston's shoulder, his arm a familiar weight around her. 14 years, he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times like we've always been together." Sarah nodded against his chest. "In all the ways that matter, I think we have." Preston's free hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. They lay there beneath the endless Texas sky, bound together by love, by family, by a shared history written in both dramatic rescues and quiet everyday moments. And as the stars continued their ancient dance overhead, Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that the rushing waters that had nearly claimed her life had instead delivered her directly to where she was always meant to be, safe in the arms of the man who had become her home. The years continued to flow, sometimes gently, sometimes with the rush of those floodwaters long ago. Thomas went east to university in '95, returning with both an engineering degree and a fiancée, a quiet, intelligent girl named Rebecca, who won Sarah's heart by asking thoughtful questions about her paintings. They settled in Austin, where Thomas worked for the railroad that had once purchased a corner of his father's land. Catherine, to no one's surprise, refused to follow convention. She studied nursing in San Antonio, then shocked her parents by announcing her intention to travel to Europe with a medical aid society. Preston had paced the floor for 3 nights before finally giving his blessing, understanding that his daughter possessed her mother's determination and courage. "She'll be fine," Sarah assured him as they watched the train pull away, carrying their daughter toward her adventure. "She has your strength and my stubbornness. There's no challenge she can't overcome." Preston had smiled ruefully. "That's what worries me." Catherine's letters arrived regularly, filled with descriptions of Paris, Rome, Vienna, places Sarah had only seen in books and paintings. She returned after 2 years, with new confidence and a Swiss doctor who looked at her as if she had personally hung the moon and stars. They married in the garden behind the ranch house, with Thomas's 3-year-old son serving as ring bearer. As the century turned, Preston and Sarah found themselves alone again, the house quieter but no less a home. They settled into the rhythms of middle age with grace, each still finding joy in the other's presence. Preston's hair silvered at the temples, making him even more distinguished in Sarah's eyes. Her own dark hair remained mostly untouched by gray, though fine lines appeared at the corners of her eyes, laugh lines, Preston called them, tracing them gently with his fingertips. Sarah's reputation as an artist continued to grow. A gallery in San Francisco requested a collection of her Texas landscapes, offering a sum that made Preston whistle in astonishment when she showed him the letter. She traveled there for the exhibition opening, her first journey beyond Texas since arriving as a young woman. "I wish you could come with me," she told Preston as she packed. He shook his head, gesturing toward the window where spring calving was in full swing. The ranch needs me right now, but you go and enjoy your triumph, Mrs. James. It's long overdue. The week in San Francisco was exhilarating, a whirlwind of gallery receptions, newspaper interviews, and meetings with other artists. Yet Sarah found herself longing for home, for Preston's solid presence and the familiar horizons of the hill country. Upon her return, Preston met her at the Austin station, his face lighting with a smile that made her heart flutter like a girl's. "Welcome home, famous artist," he greeted her, gathering her into an embrace that ignored the curious glances of passers-by. "I missed you," she whispered against his chest. "The house was too quiet without you," he admitted, loading her trunk into the wagon. "I kept turning to tell you something, only to remember you weren't there." On the drive home, Sarah told him about San Francisco, the fog rolling in from the bay, the steep hills, the cosmopolitan atmosphere so different from Austin. Preston listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Would you like to live in a city like that?" he asked as the ranch came into view. "Where your art could reach more people?" Sarah studied his profile, recognizing the generosity behind the question. Even now, he would uproot himself if he thought it would fulfill her dreams. "No," she said with certainty. "I can send my paintings to the cities. But this—" she gestured toward the ranch house where they had raised their family, toward the studio where she had created her best work, toward the man beside her who had been her partner in all things. "This is where I belong." The relief in Preston's smile told her he had been holding his breath, prepared to sacrifice his own happiness for hers, just as he had always done. Time continued its inexorable march. Grandchildren arrived: Thomas and Rebecca's brood of 4, then Catherine's twins. The house filled with noise and laughter during holidays and summer visits, then emptied again, leaving Preston and Sarah in peaceful solitude. In 1910, Preston's heart began to trouble him. Dr. Harris prescribed rest and medication, but the vibrant man who had once carried Sarah on his shoulders grew gradually weaker. She watched him struggle against his body's limitations, his frustration evident when he could no longer work alongside his ranch hands or take long rides across his beloved land. Sarah shifted her own routines, painting less to spend more time with him. They sat together on the porch each evening, watching sunsets as they had throughout their marriage, sometimes talking, often simply being together in comfortable silence. "No regrets," Preston told her one night as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "If this old heart gives out tomorrow, I want you to know I've had more happiness than any man deserves." Sarah clutched his hand, refusing to acknowledge the possibility. "You're not going anywhere anytime soon, Preston James. I won't allow it." His chuckle was weaker than it once had been, but still held the warmth that had first drawn her to him. "Yes, madam. I've never been foolish enough to argue with you when your mind is set." The next morning, Sarah woke to find Preston watching her, his blue eyes soft with love. "What is it?" she asked, touching his cheek. "Just memorizing your face," he said simply. "The way the light catches your hair in the morning, the little crease between your eyebrows when you're concerned like now." His finger gently smoothed the furrow. "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, Sarah Valdez James." Sarah blinked back tears at the tenderness in his voice. "And you're still the handsome cowboy who rescued me from certain death." "Best thing I ever did," he murmured, pulling her closer. "Saved you so you could save me right back." Preston rallied that summer, regaining enough strength to oversee the ranch operations from the porch if not from horseback. Sarah thanked God for each day, each moment, storing them in her heart like treasures. When winter arrived with unusual ferocity, Preston developed a cough that would not ease. Despite the doctor's visits, despite Sarah's constant care, pneumonia settled in his lungs with grim determination. On a cold January morning in 1911, 35 years after they met, Preston James drew his final breath with Sarah's hand clasped in his. His last words were a whispered, "I love you," the same words he had spoken to her countless times throughout their life together. Sarah buried her husband on a hilltop overlooking the ranch, in the spot where they had watched their first sunset together. The entire community turned out for the funeral. Ranchers, townspeople, railroad workers who remembered the fair dealings of Preston James, artists who had been encouraged by his support of Sarah's work. Grief enveloped her like a physical presence, a weight that made even the simplest tasks require monumental effort. For weeks, Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, touching Preston's belongings, sleeping with his shirt beside her pillow. Thomas offered to move his family to the ranch, but Sarah gently refused. "This is something I must face alone," she told her son. "Your father taught me strength. I need to find it now." Slowly, painfully, Sarah began to rebuild her life. She returned to her studio, finding that painting offered some solace, a way to process her grief through color and form. She created a series of canvases that art critics would later describe as her most powerful work, imbued with raw emotion that transcended technique. As spring arrived, Sarah found herself drawn daily to the canyon where she and Preston had met. The landscape had changed over 3 decades. Erosion had worn away some features, vegetation had reclaimed others. But the essential character remained, and Sarah could still pinpoint the exact spot where Preston had braced himself in the rising water, offering her his shoulders as a ladder to safety. On the anniversary of his death, Sarah sat alone on that hilltop grave, the Texas wind rustling through the bluebonnets that had sprung up around the headstone. "I miss you," she said aloud, running her fingers over the engraved name. "Every day, every moment. But I'm trying to live as you would want me to, with purpose, with gratitude." As if in answer, a warm breeze caressed her face, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth smells that would forever remind her of Preston. Sarah continued painting well into her 70s, her work evolving but always maintaining the connection to the land that had shaped her life. She divided her time between the ranch, which Thomas now managed, and her grandchildren's homes, becoming the family storyteller, the keeper of memories. On summer evenings, she would gather the youngest generation on the porch and tell them the story of the flood, of the cowboy who said, "Climb my shoulders, take that route." The children would listen wide-eyed, thrilling to the drama while absorbing the underlying lesson of courage, of love that could overcome any obstacle. "Is that when you fell in love with Grandpa?" Catherine's youngest daughter asked once. Sarah smiled, remembering. "I think perhaps I did, though I didn't realize it then. Sometimes love begins in a moment of danger, when you see someone's true character revealed." "Was Grandpa scared?" Thomas's son wanted to know. "If he was, he never showed it," Sarah answered. "He was too busy making sure I was safe." That's the kind of man he was, always thinking of others before himself. In her 82nd year, as another spring painted the hill country with wildflowers, Sarah fell ill. The family gathered, keeping vigil as she drifted in and out of consciousness. During one lucid moment, she beckoned Thomas closer. "The canyon," she whispered. "After I'm gone, scatter some of my ashes there, where we met." Thomas nodded, tears brimming in eyes so like his father's. "I promise, Mother." Sarah smiled weakly. "The rest on the hill with your father. We belong together." "You always have," Catherine said softly from the other side of the bed. As evening approached, Sarah grew restless, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window that only she could see. "Preston," she murmured, her voice suddenly stronger. "You came." The family exchanged glances, but no one spoke as Sarah's expression transformed with joy. "The water's rising," she said clearly, "but I'm not afraid this time." With those words, Sarah Valdez James slipped away peacefully, a smile still curving her lips, going to meet the cowboy who had saved her long ago, who waited now to help her cross one final rushing river. In accordance with her wishes, the family brought a small portion of Sarah's ashes to Rattlesnake Canyon, now part of a county park. Thomas, himself an old man with graying hair, stood at the spot his mother had described so many times. "Canyon floor filled with water fast," he recited, the words familiar from countless tellings. "The cowboy said, 'Climb my shoulders, take that route.'" As he released the ashes to the wind, a sudden gust carried them upward, swirling them toward the gnarled root that, improbably, still protruded from the canyon wall. For a moment, the family stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Thomas's eldest granddaughter, an aspiring artist like her great-grandmother, spoke. "You think they're together now? Great-grandma and great-grandpa." Thomas looked up at the blue Texas sky, remembering the love that had shaped his life, that had created a legacy spanning generations. "Yes," he said with certainty, "I believe they are." And somewhere beyond sight, beyond time itself, a young woman reached for a strong hand extended toward her, climbing once more onto the shoulders of the man who had always lifted her higher, always helped her find safe ground, their love, a root that held firm against the rushing waters of life and death, binding them together for eternity.